To grow or not to grow, that is a discussion series we are closing with today's event. The creativity of American car manufacturer Tesla continues to have a destructive impact on the internal combustion engine that formed the backbone of the German economy for decades. And yet, state intervention on battery technology made sure its new gigafactory is based in Berlin. Thus, you might say Germany is developing a green growth mindset, accepting setbacks not as failure, but as an opportunity to grow. And yet the Green Party, forming part of the next government, traditionally highlights the limits to economic growth and also pushed for the ex-innovation of nuclear energy. Dietrich Vollrath has published the book Fully Grown, arguing that a growth slowdown can be a sign of success. We're looking forward to hearing more about whether the economics profession starts embracing a post-growth narrative and whether limiting growth can deliver climate protection. We are thrilled to have Philippe Aghion with us today, a global thought leader in economic growth, who has published a new book on creative destruction. We're excited on his views on how economic growth can be reconciled with climate protection by decoupling it from emissions. Ideally, you can also link it to our next part on green macroeconomics, starting in January next year. Marianne Dumas will moderate the debate. She has called into question the green growth fad in the past and is thus well positioned to balance the competing narratives. Thanks for everyone behind the scenes who enabled today's event, in particular Tilman Waffenschmidt, who did our collective homework by reading both books, and Jagna Kudau for making the IT work seamless. If you're still a student willing to make a dent into decarbonization with us, get in touch via our website, www.decarb.world, and join our team of enthusiastic changemakers. Thank you. And Marianne, over to you.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Future of Growth, Creative Destruction, or a Slowdown of Success, or a Successful Slowdown, rather, I think. I will start by saying that we will have ample time, I hope, for Q&A from the audience. And the way this will happen is that you should put your questions in the Q&A chat. And I think there's a way of upvoting as well. So those that will surface will be selected, or those that seem most relevant. So I will start by introducing Dietrich Vollrath, who is professor and chair of the economics department at the University of Houston. He has written extensively about the structural changes that underpin the growth process, including the role of land ownership, the process of urbanization, educational institutions. And his most recent book is called Fully Grown: Why a Stagnant Economy is a Sign of Success. According to the preface, it arose from his work on writing an undergraduate textbook on growth and from writing the Growth Economics blog. In the process of exposing to a more lay audience the process of growth, he realized that the growth slowdown experienced by the US since the early 2000s was a puzzle that needed a careful look. So this, I think, attests to the importance of articulating economic principles for a wider audience. It enriches economics, and I think that's what we do tonight. So Dietrich, over to you to explain to us why a stagnant economy may be a sign of success and what the implications might be for mitigating climate change.
Great, thank you, and thanks for having me and letting me participate in this function. Right, so the origin of the book I was working on Fully Grown was to understand slower growth and where it came from, and as you kind of tell from the subtitle that Marianne mentioned, that the ultimate kind of conclusion that I drew out was that the slow growth in the US, and I think kind of by extension, you can think of kind of the Western developed world, has a similar story and nuances, of course, that growth slowdown was in some sense driven by all these positive things that happened in the past, and that we were kind of living with the consequences of. And very briefly, the core of that argument was that much of the growth slowdown we see today has to do with forces of population aging. So rapid growth in the past due to an increase in the number of workers relative to population, and now the reverse is kind of this bulge in the US in particular. The baby boom generation leaves the workforce. And that was one of the just big accounting wise, that's just a big key for explaining a lot of the differential in growth. And then when you look back, it's like, so why was there this bulge in population and then a steep decline in population growth. And it's tied to things like the wider availability of contraception. It's women's ability to enter the workforce and in new professions and more extensively than in the past, which had ramifications for people to take advantage of careers and start families later, and made choices that were built around smaller families, but all for kind of positive reasons. Things we would view as, I think, kind of unqualified goods, in particular women's ability to organize their lives in the manner in which they wish. Then that's kind of had an odd consequence a couple decades later as population growth slowed down. We kind of are just living with the consequences of that. So in that sense, kind of slow growth was not something to look at and be particularly frightened of. It was kind of an unintended consequence. And a second aspect of it that's associated with kind of a positive is that structural changes in the economy away from producing things and towards producing services, doing more stuff like this as opposed to snapping together pieces and to create refrigerators, has arisen in pretty much every country. Kind of follows a trajectory that's relatively similar in terms of kind of peaking in manufacturing and then moving away from it. And that's driven in large part by the fact that we're really, really good and highly productive at making things. We're very productive in manufacturing, and our preferences and our demands have moved away from taking advantage of those savings to buy lots and lots of extra new stuff. We don't want 10 refrigerators in our house. So we take the savings that we get from having kind of cheap, relatively easily available refrigerators, and we spend them on things like education and attending webinars and take travel and service activities that have maybe less of a scope for productivity increase. And again, that's kind of a consequence of success in the sense that we've gotten very productive at producing some things, and that's kind of unintendedly resulted in slower economic growth in recent times. And so in that sense, you kind of look backwards and say, why is growth so slow? Is that something we should be worried? Should we be fixing this, right? Should we be looking at policies to accelerate growth per se, right? Should we be looking and worried about accelerating the growth of GDP per capita as an object in itself? And I think the answer to that, it's come up with a book, is I don't know that that's the right answer. That's the growth rate itself is not kind of what we're after. We're after well-being, utility, welfare, however we want to refer to it. And that's changing in many ways how we conceive of our welfare, our well-being, our utility. And that change in conception that we've had as we've become basically pretty rich is that we're willing to make trade-offs to accept goods, services, activities that are less conducive. They translate less into rapid economic growth and maybe more into other areas. And that's where I think that connects. And I didn't dive into this in the book, but I think there's the clear connection that I think your group and everyone here is kind of picks up on, is that the idea of focusing on environmental consequences of our activities is a perfectly valid way of kind of using our resources and going forward. And we may be making choices, and I think have started making choices over a long time to change how our consumption behavior, change our production behavior towards, well, I'll just, to some a greener or more environmentally friendly technologies, products, ways of living. To the extent that it's slowed things like global warming or completely eliminated fossil fuels, no. But I think we can see over time that we've started to adapt, and now I think Niels brought this up with Tesla as kind of this mass disruptor of the auto industry, and kind of forcing most automakers to chase them in terms of producing electric cars. And that's kind of an example of what I'm talking about, which is our desire and preferences for what we produce and consume are changing. And that leads directly into changes in what people innovate on, and which directions they innovate. And I think that's actually a great example, because it gets to this larger point, which is that changing where we go and how we innovate and how we want our products to be produced and how many resources we want them to use doesn't necessarily require that growth be slow. And now it has slowed for a variety of reasons that like I said, I argue that we're positives, but it's not a necessity that growth be low in order to have low environmental impacts. Tesla contributes a massive amount, right? It's kind of accelerating in size. It contributes to GDP. It's very innovative in that sense, and it's replacing. In some sense, it's stepping in and replacing traditional manufacturing and forcing traditional manufacturers of cars to change what they produce. But that doesn't imply that the car industry has shrunk. And in many ways, it may have grown. Now, has it grown in a way that's more environmentally friendly? That I think it's headed that direction. Although, right, we have this. There's the second order ramifications of how do you produce the electricity that drives a Tesla. But I think that it demonstrates the fact that the innovations that lead to more environmental friendly outcomes are not necessarily innovations that necessarily make the growth rate lower or the growth rate higher. We're kind of entered a weird world where it's not 100% clear what the ultimate impacts on economic growth will be of various innovations. I think one way to think about this is you could think of solar, right? In the sense of solar energy replacing existing sources of electricity, right? So in the sense of creative destruction, we want solar energy to creatively destroy coal industries and fossil fuel industries. And if we take advantage of solar energy, it's becoming massively cheaper. There was something this morning I just read about the scale at which solar has been expanding in the US is kind of, I think it's quintupled in size in maybe the last 10 years. If we take advantage of solar to replace our existing electricity production, and we use that to produce basically everything we just normally produce, okay, well then GDP hasn't really grown at all. We're just producing the same stuff we produced before, but we're producing it in a greener way. Right, we're produced with a lower environmental impact, so that's very good, right? Like I think we'd all be supportive of that, but it wouldn't look like it had produced much in terms of economic growth. Now, does that mean that it has to be the case that environmental friendly creative destruction leads to zero growth or low growth? No. The Tesla example is the counter there. It's in some sense the way I'd argue is that you should keep in mind that the impact of environmentally friendly policies to reduce resource use, to green up energy sources, to just reduce our footprint at all, have an ambiguous relationship to the growth rate. Simply saying we want to slow growth won't necessarily change environmental outcomes, and changing environmental outcomes won't necessarily slow or accelerate growth. I think maybe one of the arguments that I pulled out in the book, not necessarily related to the environment, was just that when it comes to thinking about other objectives that we have, that we want to decouple them in some sense from worrying about their impact on the growth rate per se, because the growth rate itself isn't a great indicator of kind of quote how we're doing on multiple dimensions. It's a really good indicator. GDP is a great indicator of the amount of economic activity in producing goods and services, but it doesn't tell us whether we're doing a good job of doing that in a green or resource or earth friendly manner. It doesn't tell us whether we're producing goods and services that are, in a broader sense, socially beneficial. I use this example in class all the time. $100 billion porn industry is $100 billion of GDP. It's a kind of a disgusting industry, but it counts, right? Because GDP is kind of a dumb counter of economic activity. So decoupling our growth at all in the discussion of making environmental advances, I think, is necessary. And in that sense, I think that kind of all sides of this debate need to do that. There's, I think, a side that says, oh, well, we can't possibly sacrifice growth in order to do these environmental things. That's terrible. Like how, what about living standards? How will people get forward? And I think that we need to decouple that, because it's not true that environmentally friendly policies necessarily mean lower living standards. And then from kind of the environmental side, I think we have to get past the idea that it requires low or negative growth in order to make environmental progress. That's not true either. These things, they're not so tied that we should think of them as essentially identical, or two sides of the same coin. We want to separate the idea of what, the growth rate from these other objectives. And I think if we get to that point, then we have a little healthier chance of thinking about, do we want to pursue these policies that allow us to have a lower environmental impact, and worry less in some sense about whether they will nudge the growth rate up or down. Because I think the worry I have about coupling them and making kind of degrowth the motive force behind improving environmental quality is that I think it risks throwing away or de-emphasizing activities we need and we want to help us with reducing our environmental impact. And by this I mean that, this kind of relates to, what Professor Aghion's long, history of work on this, which is that kind of that creative destruction. We want the incentives there for companies, for entrepreneurs, for innovators to be coming up with clever solutions to environmental issues, to finding ways to destroy existing, quote, dirty industries and replace them with clean ones. We want those incentives to turn over and be there and be available and push in the right direction. And those incentives being available are in many ways part of the process of economic growth. So we don't want to throw away that urge, that incentive for innovation and entrepreneurship in that direction, just to say that GDP growth is zero or below zero. All that said, I think, and this is where, in many ways I would defer to, Professor Aghion to be able to kind of talk about the nuances of this. What direction that innovation goes is very much dictated by the incentives, and those incentives aren't necessarily always lined up with finding a greener, cleaner solution, with replacing kind of, quote, dirty resources and things like that. The process of creative destruction is driven by people chasing potential profits, and if the structures and the infrastructure is set up to pursue kind of dirty technologies, then it's going to end up with dirty technologies. If it's set up to pursue clean ones, then pursue clean ones. So. And I think I have a couple of minutes left. So let me give you kind of two examples where I think about this. This is, so if you think about kind of where China is at the moment, and it's heavily dependent on coal, it's kind of in this world where it's built and growing with a large infrastructure of built-in networks of kind of bad environmental impact technologies, coal and fossil fuels. And so the incentives, to the extent that they exist to innovate and be entrepreneurial in China, are to use those resources and supply and innovate within that structure, which kind of perpetuates that structure. And so what we ideally have is a change in policy, a change in industrial structure that would encourage innovators and entrepreneurs to pursue the clean versions. And I think an example here of that kind of change, I would look at Africa and their adoption of phones. So this isn't an environmental case in particular, but right. So I think we kind of know that the continent of Africa, right, is behind, is relatively underdeveloped throughout the 20th century, and does not have the capacity to install massive landline phone networks. So as they get to the point where they begin investing in those communication networks, what do? Well, they skip past landline networks completely and move to mobile telephony, right? Cell phone towers. And now you watch Sub-Saharan Africa innovating in mobile telephone space with M-Pesa and other digital currencies, and a massive amount of entrepreneurial activity that skipped an entire generations of technology, skipped landlines, skipped all this stuff that kind of went into the Western world's communication structure, just didn't get built. And it didn't need to get built because they were able to leapfrog past and use a more modern technology that ultimately allowed them to not have the impact of digging up trenches and laying cable and running lines everywhere. So I think what we're after in pursuing an environmental future is finding ways to get ourselves leapfrogged past dirty technologies. And that may include things like the Western world subsidizing R&D at these places. It may include the Western world, in some sense, kind of handing out that technology for free. So like, here's solar panel patents, here, knock yourselves out, start building these, but trying to get them to skip past would be a way of leveraging that creative destructive power that has driven growth for, in many ways, forever, leveraging that to push it in a direction that goes in the direction of environmental friendliness. And whether that ultimately turns into high or low growth, like I said, I think is less crucial whether it produces a high growth rate or low growth rate than that it heads us in the right direction, right? But we don't want to lose that kind of creative destructive activity, because that's what's going to generate those new sources, and that's going to generate that leapfrogging that we're after. And so we want to be careful to kind of decouple growth, I think, in this pursuit of environmental outcomes, so that we don't wander down a path where we can't get to where we want to be, and that we kind of hold ourselves back in terms of pursuing better living standards because we're worried about environmental impacts. I don't think these two things are at odds. So I think that's about kind of where everything I had to go with, Marion. So if you want to jump in and have questions.
Yes, great. So I think I will start with a question from the audience, which has to do with the role of services, since the shift to services is one of your causes of the slowdown, and at the same time, maybe a mechanism by which to get a form of green growth. So the question is, services, you say that services have less potential for productivity increase. Yeah. But, in theory, we can imagine you argue there are intrinsic reasons why that's the case, but we can also imagine services where you could see a lot of productivity increase. Sure. And this could be a mechanism for creating green growth in the sense of rapid increase in living standards with far lower environmental impacts. The follow-up, though, is that it's never going to be zero environmental impact. So any form of growth at scale will still increase our impact, and we're up to absolute boundaries on our planetary system. So that's the follow-up question from this first one. If you can tackle both, that would be great.
Yeah. So let me the services one first, right? I have made the argument. I think there is something a little intrinsic about services that makes it difficult to have high productivity growth, just because it's your time, right? I'm doing this webinar and I can't do another one at the same time. And so fundamentally, it's hard to increase productivity, harder. I should say it's not impossible, right? It's harder perhaps than making refrigerators more efficiently with fewer workers. But it's not impossible. And there's right, and I think, and I would easily admit that over the last year and a half, I've probably been somewhat positively surprised by some of the possibilities of productivity increases in some sense that you can achieve on services based on some modern technologies. But I guess one of the points I'd make is that, so let's say services are kind of inherently have slower productivity growth. Who cares? I mean, so we have somewhat lower productivity growth in the long run, and you know, when countries hit a point where productivity growth isn't as high because we tend to do more service work than we do producing things. Okay, I mean, I don't know that that's a problem. If we're making choices that we've, you know, in some sense, if the world kind of gets to the point where its material needs are taken care of, and people are making choices to take advantage of services, and that happens to have lower productivity growth, okay, I guess, you know, I kind of see that as a win as opposed to a loss. So and that's maybe where I mentioned kind of that decoupling. I think we maybe need to get out of our heads this worry that, but what if the growth rate slows down? What if it does? Maybe, you know, maybe that's not the growth rate isn't the point. Now, to the question about, does this have a, you know, an environmental impact, or is it possible that, in some sense, is it impossible to have that productivity growth without some additional environmental impact? Well, I mean, I think we know for sure, right, that in some sense we probably can't and don't anticipate the environmental impact of all the changes we make in the economy, right? So you know, I think that the moving towards like the electric cars is, you know, it's like, well, that's really green. Well, it depends, right? It depends on, is it a coal plant that's producing electricity that charged your Tesla? Well, then that's quite different than a solar panel charging your Tesla. And if services are being kind of provided on a larger and larger scale, but that, say, requires a massive amount of infrastructure and computers and servers and electricity and things that is provided in a dirty manner, then yeah, it could potentially have an impact. But I guess I don't know that that's a necessary connection, right? I think that is a distinct choice about how we would provide the resources necessary to do these additional service activities. So I think it's not a necessary connection that growing through services or growing in general necessarily makes the footprint larger. You know, our footprint on a number of resources has gone down as the economies have grown. We you know, swapped into different resources. We've gone away from other ones. So it's possible. I'm not saying it guaranteed, right? But I think it is plausible to imagine there is a future in which there can be increases in living standards, and yet we are not having a bigger and bigger environmental footprint.
Okay, we will have other questions for you, but we will hand the floor to Philippe for the time being. It's my pleasure to introduce Philippe Aghion. Philippe Aghion holds professorships across the channel. I'm here in the UK, so that's why I'm saying that. Being professor at Collège de France, at INSEAD, and at the London School of Economics, as well as a fellow of the Econometric Society and of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and I probably forget things. So with Peter Hoeit, Philippe is a towering figure in the theory of economic growth, having developed what is called the Schumpeterian growth paradigm. This theory formalizes the core insights of Schumpeter, who saw the capitalist economy as inherently dynamic system driven by entrepreneurs desiring to innovate to create rents, thus destroying the rents created by previous entrepreneurs. This has led to many new insights about growth, policies that promote it, and the role of the state and institutions in shaping growth. In recent years, Philippe has made several contributions to the question of how this process can be directed to solve problems such as climate change. His recent book, The Power of Creative Destruction, summarizes this large body of work and charts a perspective for the future of growth. Philippe, over to you to explain how creative destruction can save the day when it comes to climate change.
Thank you. So do you want me to use slides or no slides? What do you prefer, Marion?
I think it's very much up to you. What will support your points better?
Okay. So let me go there. So first, it's a pleasure to listen to Dietrich. I share a lot of what he said, and so maybe I will repeat a lot of what he said. So how do we look at that? So first, so I don't know if you see the slides there. Slideshow. Voilà. Okay, can you see the slides? Yeah, you see them?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, excellent. So, so what we try to do is, so In fact, first I want to say that we have this debate on would negative growth solve our problem. It's true that if you look at history, you see the takeoff in temperature and coincides with the takeoff in growth. I mean, the history of growth is 200 years old. There was essentially no growth worldwide until 1820. And the true takeoff comes with the first industrial revolution of the steam engine revolution, England, then France, and then other countries. And that started exactly when you see temperature going up. And there's been simulations. What would have happened without the industrial revolution? And you can see on the right-hand side, temperature would have remained constant. So it's clearly, at least, there is a coincidence between the increase in temperature and CO2 emissions on one hand and the takeoff of growth. So some people say, like, why don't we go back? Why don't we just reverse the clock and go back to where we were before? You see, as much as we can. We had a natural experiment, which was, and also, I mean, there is further evidence that you see China, now, and India, they are taking, are growing fast, and the fast growth of India and China, of course, makes them key CO2 producers worldwide. And so, so now you see, we had a natural experiment with COVID. I don't know about Germany or England, but we had a lockdown in France between March and June 2020, and the lockdown, induced a reduction in GDP of 35% and reduction of CO2 emissions by 8% only. So we could, of course, rely entirely, put the world in permanent lockdown. Now you have to know that the lockdown, at least in France, I don't know about other countries, had terrible effects on psychology of the young. I mean, it was just, a huge toll on a big fraction of the population. And also it imposed a big toll on developing countries because many people died there, not just of COVID, but of starvation because of the reduction of economic activity. So clearly the negative growth per se is not the way out. The way out is green innovation. The problem is that innovation is not spontaneously green. We showed with my colleagues Van Reenen, David Emus, Ralph Martin, Antoine de Chellepret, in a paper which is in the JP 2016, that firms that used to innovate in dirty technologies keep innovating spontaneously on dirty technologies. So that first tells you that creative destruction could help you there because new firms, they don't have this past dependence problem. They don't have the past, which is a burden on them. Okay, so already creative destruction per se can help induce green growth because of that. Okay, and now, of course, what you want to redirect dealing with existing firms, you want to redirect the direction of innovation. And the question is, how would you do that? Okay, so first instrument is the carbon tax. The carbon tax, so here we looked at automotive industry. That was the work that I did with Van Reenen, de Chellepret, Martin, and Emus. We were looking at dirty and clean technologies, electric vehicles to combustion engines, from the clean to the dirty. And we looked at patents in those, and we looked at how we were regressing the extent to which a firm at time T patents more clean than dirty with the fuel price and with the stock of clean and dirty patents. And the main result is that first, the main result is that the stock of clean would make you innovate cleaner. The stock of dirty would make you innovate more dirty. So if you were to look at the propensity to innovate clean, for example, measured by the log of 1 plus clean patent and minus the log of 1 plus dirty patent, that would be clearly positively affected by your stock of clean and negatively affected by your stock of dirty. That's what we call the path dependence. So if you let the world, no intervention of the state and of nobody, and firms used to innovate dirty, they will keep innovating dirty, and that's terrible for the world. But now the good news is that the carbon tax in particular, but not only the carbon tax, can redirect, will redirect innovation towards clean innovation. So that's one instrument. But the carbon tax is not the only instrument. You have other instruments. You have industrial policy. For example, I was very much hoping that at the COP 26, we would announce the creation of a European DARPA for energy, the equivalent of the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or the equivalent of the BARDA, Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority, that we produce vaccines, to whom we owe that we transform ARN messenger in 1 year in mass production of vaccine. I think we can do the same to push the production of clean technologies. And I think that's another leg. So you have the carbon tax, but you have also industrial policy, and you have also the role of civil society. Very important, the role of civil society. The role of civil society is, so you see, I very much believe in the triangle between firms, the state can use carbon tax and industrial policy and subsidy to clean innovation, and civil society. And for example, in recent work with Roland Benamou, Ralph Martin, and Alexandra Roulet, we look at the role of competition and consumers. And in fact, what we showed was the following. Consumers are in countries that are which value more or less clean technology. So if you are in a country that value more clean technology, we observe that firms will have a bigger propensity to innovate clean. That's the first row of this table, okay? But what's very interesting is that there is the interaction term between values and competition. Firms will tend to innovate cleaner in countries where consumers care more about environment, and that you measure from World Value Survey, asking people if they would pay more for clean, or if they would agree to lose, wealth and income for clean. But also there is this positive interaction between value and competition. That means that in countries where consumers value the environment, competition is a force that pushes for more clean innovation. The reason is very simple. Suppose that Dietrich is the only producer of goods. And it's true that consumers worry about clean, but if they have no choice but purchasing from Dietrich, and Dietrich does not produce clean products or doesn't use clean technologies, they have no choice but purchasing from Dietrich. But if now Dietrich competes with me and I'm doing clean, then you see, they will go to me, and then Dietrich will lose customers. That will induce Dietrich to innovate clean in order to escape competition with me. So competition magnifies the effect of values of environmental values on the propensity of firms to innovate clean. And that we show that it's equivalent to a very high increase in carbon tax. You remember that in France, we had the yellow vests because we had a very stupidly designed carbon tax 3 years ago. And we have to do it more smartly, take into account the individual situations and the fact that in some areas in France, in particular suburban areas, people have no access to good public transports, and the only possibility they have is to use a car. And so there you have to be smart in the way you implement the carbon tax. But on top of the carbon tax, this force, which is the civil society acting through the name and shame, you see, you inform consumers that firm is virtuous and another firm is not virtuous. That together with competition on the product market is a very effective driver of clean innovation. So you see, it's very interesting because in fact, you have various instruments. Investment in green innovation, you have the carbon tax, but you have also public investment or public subsidies to green innovation. You have nuclear plants. I know that you hate them, but I believe that France is right to maintain nuclear plants, but at the same time, develop a new source of energy like renewable, nuclear fusion, hydrogen, and many other, and aeolian and all that. But I think it's good also that we maintain nuclear plants or renew them for a while. In the meantime, we are developing these new technologies. And as I mentioned, having information of consumers, that's what I call education policy, and competition policy together is also a very big driver of clean innovation. And I want to mention a last one, which is based on current work I'm doing with Timo Boppard, Matthew Schwarzman, Michael Peters, and Fabrizio Zilibotti on structural change. And that very much links to what Dietrich spoke about. It's very interesting that we are looking at the relationship between service employment and emissions across countries, across counties within US, across commuting zone within US. So we look at emissions of CO2 as a function of the service share in employment and the agriculture share of employment. And what you find if you do cross-country, you find that there is a clear negative correlation between CO2 emission and service share. But if you look also within the US cross-county panel, and those are the previous was cross-country panel, now it's cross-county panel, you find again a negative correlation between service share and CO2 emission. And also if you look at commuting zone, within commuting, you see again, you find the same. So it's very interesting that you could speed up structural change. And it's true that the big problem of India and China is that they industrialized a lot to grow faster. It's very hard for us to say, don't do it, because we in Europe or in the US, we did exactly the same to develop ourselves. But if we were able to help other countries like in Africa and elsewhere to essentially bypass mass industrialization and go almost directly from agriculture to services, that would, of course, help us enormously to prevent, further increase in CO2 emissions worldwide. And so that, I think, is a policy that we should do. And so we should be very careful, make sure that we favor this fast transition of other developing countries to services as quickly as possible. So you see, overall, you have green innovation is what will take us on. It's innovation in our habits as well, but it's also innovation, for isolating buildings, for transport, more electric, for, different source of energy and being more efficient and all that. And you have many ways. Carbon tax is, of course, one way, but you have to do it smartly. Invest subsidy to green innovation, industrial policy done smartly. I think intermediate source of energy, including nuclear, you can't disregard them, but you have to make sure that when you use them, you don't discourage research in more advanced sources of energy that you want ultimately, and things like competition together with values and is very important, as well as structural change. And so you see, you have many instruments to induce green innovation, and it very much involves what I mentioned at the beginning, is this triangle between firms, the state, and civil society. I think this is key to the success. Bowles and Carlin talk a lot about this, the triangle in the context of COVID in particular, but it's equally true for green innovation. I think we need the state, but we also need civil society to make sure that firms will do the right thing and that we will move towards greener growth. Alors, as just a last word on the slowdown, it's true there has been a slowdown in growth in the US in particular, but the problem is that the slowdown in growth, and that people like Jim Besson and others, and I did work on that, and it's in the chapter 6 of my book, but I've done work with Clino, Thibaut Boppart, Antonin Bergeau, Axigit and Attes have done work. Of course, it's the work of Autor, Van Rienen, Dorn, and Katz, and other people have done work as well. And it appears that very much the slowdown is very much related to the emergence of superstar firms that became superstar using the IT revolution. So first, it was a very good thing to have Walmart, Facebook, Google. They improved our lives. They catered much better to consumers' needs and to the time variation of these consumer needs. They manage complexity much better. They can diversify much better. So there are many good things about the IT. And it's also a fantastic engine of growth. But the problem with IT is that it led to the emergence of superstar firms. These superstar firms stifled innovation by other firms. And that's why you have the slowdown. So the slowdown there is very much related to market concentration going up and to rents going up and to inequality going up, things that you don't want so much, and competition going down. So that's the problem with the slowdown we have in the US. It's not a very nice slowdown. It's a slowdown very much associated with the emergence of big conglomerates that block everything, quite essentially, and a reduction in competition, a big increase in inequality, and that's not something you want. And creative destruction going down, including the creative destruction leading to firms that are cleaner. So that's the problem I have. I think it calls from renewed competition policy. That's what Biden is trying to do. I think Biden is right to deal with competition policy in the US because the competition policy did not adapt to the IT revolution and the AI revolution. And I think we need to adapt institutions to those, but of course to push towards, each time we do that, to favor green innovation. I think I will stop there and so that we have more time for discussion. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to start with a question that I hope paraphrases accurately the question by Luca Mario that's been upvoted a lot, but adds a bit of a twist to it. So theoretically, so you claim that through innovation, we can ensure an increase in material living standards without further impacting the environment. So one way of calling that is absolute decoupling of growth and environmental impacts. So the rate by which we increase the environmental efficiency of production is larger than the rate of growth for that to happen. So that as we grow, impacts decrease. Or so far, when it comes to carbon emissions and biodiversity loss and water stress, we have only seen relative decoupling. So our environmental innovations are not sufficiently fast relative to growth to offset the negative effects of growth. More generally, thermodynamically, there's a bit of a limit on just how low impacts can be, like how low energy consumption and the waste flow of any activity can be. So do you see this as an inherent limit, the fact that we don't yet have absolute decoupling, or as the result of weak policy?
In France, we had decoupling. France is not perfect.
But relative, only, not...
in France, CO2 emissions have gone down over time. And we have positive growth. We don't have fantastic growth in France. There are many things that don't go well in France. We have a very inefficient innovation system, poor research, fundamental research. I have many bad things to say about my own country, but it's true that so far we have achieved that France reduces CO2 emissions and has positive growth. And we achieved that because of two things. We have to be totally honest. France contributes to world CO2 emission by only 0.8%. 0.8. And why did we do that? Because we have the nuclear plants. I think, it's not realistic to have an environmental policy that says, close down all your nuclear plants now. I think this is irresponsible. I mean, that's not, especially if you are not on the seismical area like in Japan, I think, maybe some old plants you want to close, but the idea to say you will just do away with nuclear now and close now the nuclear, that's irresponsible. That led Germany to increase CO2 emissions much more than we did. So you have to be smart in dealing with nuclear or other intermediate source of energy while pursuing research in renewables, in nuclear fusion, in hydrogen and all that. But I think there are ways that you can already achieve the double objective of positive growth of per capita GDP. I'm not obsessed with per capita GDP, by the way. I'm after growth of utils and growth of living standards. So I'm not wedded to per capita GDP, and let's be clear on that. But you can combine growth in those with the reduction of CO2 emission, but you need to have a smart policy of directing technical change towards green and of energy transition. You have to manage intelligently the energy transition. Closing down all nuclear plants right away, I think it's a very stupid energy transition policy, to be totally honest with you. So I think you can do it, Marion.
Can you expand on this with respect to the fact that there isn't just one environmental impact, carbon? We're dealing with any activity has an impact. When you reduce carbon through nuclear, you get waste, you reduce it.
Yeah, but the waste we improve. There is always an impact, but I am after CO2 emission. I am after global warming. That's my priority because that's what will lead us to disaster. The disaster will come from the temperature. And now we are much better at dealing with the waste. We are making very rapid progress in dealing with the waste. So just saying because there is waste, I stop now completely all nuclear, I think it's irresponsible. You should you should improve your nuclear and continue innovating in the management of the waste. But of course, nuclear is transitional. I'm not advocating nuclear forever, but I say that you can't, it's not responsible to say, I will do what Germany did. I think this is irresponsible. I think that's really not a good policy. And France, you know, we would contribute to much more than 0.8% worldwide if we were to close down our nuclear plant. Our CO2 emission would jump up like this, and that would be very silly. I think we have to phase down progressively. Meanwhile, we develop other sources, and that's, I think, is the whole management of energy transition.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to ask a question I have, which is that
yes.
A summary of your book is that we need more and better growth. I'm interested in the interaction between more and better. So do we need more growth in order to get better growth? Do we need to see expansion in the size of sector, in the aggregate demand of a particular sector to encourage enough new entry and new technologies? Or can we manage somehow without having to stimulate aggregate demand in every sector that matters?
Yeah, what I call growth is really, I will tell you, growth is for me is the growth of utils, is improving our lives. You know, when there is someone who advocates negative growth in France, I say, look, you know, I give you the choice between a dentist of the 50s and a dentist nowadays. I remember when I was a child, going to the dentist, you had the drilling forever. It was awful. And now you go to the dentist, you don't feel anything. So when I say that to a negative growth person, I tell you that he will never go to the dentist of the 1950s. That's what I call growth. Growth is innovation. Growth I measure not by GDP. I measure by having new things, by having growth of utils, by having things that improve our lives. You see what I mean? In growth of welfare, you see, and there are many ways to measure it. But my challenge, I am a good Scandinavian social democrat, and my dream is to be more innovative for Europe, but in a way which is greener and more inclusive. Some people believe that to be more innovative, like in the US, you have to renounce being green and being inclusive. And some people believe that if you choose to be inclusive and green, you have to renounce being innovative. That's not true. For example, if you have the flex security system on the labor market in Denmark, like you have in Denmark, to manage, that makes you more innovative because you manage creative destruction better. But we know that in Denmark, there is zero effect on health of becoming unemployed. In the US, there is terrible effect on health to become unemployed, as Case and Angus didn't show. Second policy, education. There are many people who are very smart, many young children very smart. They are born to poor families who don't give them knowledge and aspirations. If you make education much more egalitarian, much more accessible, you will make your economy more innovative, but also more inclusive. If you have more competition, like you need to have in the US, you will make more entry. That will make your economy more innovative. But we know also that innovation by entrance makes the growth more inclusive, increases social mobility. I've done work on that with Blondel and others to show that. So it's not at all, and of course you have to make sure it's, as I said, innovation is not spontaneously greener. So you will need the role of state and civil society to make sure that whatever you do goes towards green innovation, okay? So, but that you can do that. You said, I mean, I'm not a stupid optimist. I'm not a Panglossian optimist. I am a Gramscian optimist, like Gramsci. Gramsci, it's the optimism of fighting. I know you can do it, like the researcher. We need to do it. I mean, we need to achieve that. And I think we can. And I think Scandinavian countries, by the way, they didn't do everything right, but they are pretty good in terms of being green and being inclusive and being innovative. They do pretty good job. I don't say we should exactly copy Denmark or Finland, but it's very interesting. They show that you can combine being innovative, being green, and being inclusive.
Great. I think we're going to give Dietrich an opportunity to respond to Philippe. I'm sure there will be some vivid exchange about the role of the superstar firms in the slowdown as Dietrich tries to account for that and put it in the balance with the other drivers.
Yeah. And that was great, Philippe. Thank you. That I think there's like a couple things that came out of what Philippe was saying that I think tied to what it helped in some sense be more direct about some of the things that I was trying to get across, and I think one in particular that stood out for me is the research and the findings about the interaction of competition and values, which I think is crucial to that point of to exactly this, that it is entirely possible to be inclusive and innovative and increase well-being by leveraging and using the creative destructive mechanism, by using the market, by using the incentives that we set up to set firms in some sense against one another to compete to be green and to compete to be inclusive and to compete to provide us with better well-being. And regardless of what happens to GDP per capita, you know, as Philippe said, it's about increasing welfare. But I think that that's a really powerful demonstration of not throwing away this kind of innovative mechanism we have in terms of market structures, but pushing it in the right directions, right? And the state and civil society, we very much need to put direction on that. And we've done it, you know, to your point, Denmark's kind of done it well, the US does it poorly, and we can get run down these alleys. And I think that's maybe our biggest danger is, right, is it feeds on itself. So if we don't turn the direction of where we're pointing kind of this innovative, this energy, then we end up with dirtier and dirtier and less inclusive kind of outcomes. But it's possible, right? And I think that's the key, is that there are plausible ways to turn it in the right direction that take effort, right? That's not, the market by itself necessarily won't do it, but we don't want to throw away the market innovating mechanism, because that's not the answer. The answer is we have to shape it and push it in the right direction. So in that sense, I think that was a very much more coherent way of saying some of the things I was trying to say, and I agree. So I think it was, and I think that's a really powerful result, right? Like in terms of the actual kind of growth rate stuff, I mean, the competition and superstar firm thing, in terms of how much it accounts for, when I do the accounting, I find that it's less important overall. It's there, right? It's there and it's a drag. But I think it's less relevant relative to, say, population changes. But to the point we were just discussing, in some sense, it's less whether the concentration of superstar firms is lowering the growth rate of GDP. Is it narrowing and limiting the innovative activity? Is it narrowing and limiting the direction of innovation? Is Amazon scooping up potential competitors, preventing us from getting a solution to delivery of goods that is green, that is greener, or that is more sustainable? So that's, I think, exactly right, that change in structure over the last 20, 30 years, where mass companies have kind of taken, really kind of sucked up kind of all the innovation into themselves. I think that is a really open question that it is part of this civil society and markets having to be directed. Do I want Walmart making all the decisions about how we innovate in logistics over the future? I don't know that I want Walmart making those decisions themselves. I want competitors pushing them to be more efficient, more green, better about lower environmental impacts, sourcing products that have lower environmental impacts. I want all that. And so I think there is a role for thinking about competition policy and that, in order to again, kind of push us in that right direction, and we get competition working for us that way, and then I think we begin to see a lot of improvements. So I think there's a lot of complementarities about what Philippe and I had to say, and in terms of how the potential for how to go forward. I think the potential is there. We have work to do. I'm optimistic in the same sense that I think Philippe said. It's possible. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, but it's possible to push us in the right direction.
Okay, great. So I'm going to take a bit of a contrarian or devil's advocate a little bit point of view, because it sounds like you're both saying we don't really care about GDP per se. We care about growth in utils, or we care about what else is going on at the same time. But growth per se, in the sense of increased outputs, may be an important mechanism to get the things we want. So, there's research in economics showing that the expansion of markets pulls innovation. That you also have, and this is an important question in the chat about debt, that a lot of policymakers are very worried about GDP and growth in GDP because of the increasing amount of debt, and we need to invest in infrastructure that's complementary to green innovation in the next 10 years that will add to the debts. And we need a way of some credible pathway to repaying that. And is it possible to have enough of the dynamic, entry of firms and so on, if we don't have some kind of, GDP growth in the pure sense of GDP, of increased productivity? Just asking about, so in other words, Dietrich, you said that the causes of the slowdown are not so worrisome, but I'm asking about the consequences.
Yeah, consequences.
Some essential fuel to the mechanism of creative destruction that we need for, and of the debt and of financing simply the transition moving forward.
So I think there's kind of two things there. I think there is a sense in which, right, you kind of your standard, and now I'm just quoting the, Philippe's book from years ago when I read it, right? Like the size of the market is going to matter, right? In the sense that, right, if there is a sense in kind of that the larger the pool of potential profits out there, that's going to maybe create more incentives for people to compete, right? And to innovate. So are we worried about a smaller economy or populations shrinking and being smaller markets? That I think that's a real concern in some sense. That like innovating for a small group of people is fewer projects will look plausible. Although that on the side that has its own environmental impact, which may be worth it in some sense. I think there's an interesting discussion there. On the debt side, I think of these things in some sense very, very separate. I think when we're talking about growth of innovation and productivity and living standards, that's on the real side, and can the government pay off its debt is in some sense a completely different question to me. It goes back to Keynes, right? Like we can always find a way to pay off debt. That's just money. And it sounds weird, but that's just how do we shuffle the money around in the economy to achieve debt. What we're doing with that debt is saying, rather than me spending this money on, on tacos today, we're going to take that money and we're going to spend it on building in a more robust electrical grid in the US. I live in Texas. I would kill for a more robust electrical grid. So that it provides incentives for people to come up with more green energy sources, right? And allows them to sell across state lines and things like that, and make this market more competitive. That's saying, that's kind of us in civil society and the state saying we want to kind of move who's making decisions about purchasing. We want to do this more collectively and pursue this. Now that's going to generate some nominal debt that has to be paid off in the future. Okay, that's a financial issue that is dealable in a sense that I think isn't tied to the real side. Can we achieve green outcomes while improving living standards? Which I know seems maybe weird to say that they're unrelated, but I think they're less related than we think. It's a political issue more than it is an economics issue in that sense, to me.
I wanted to add something on the debt. I mean, my feeling is that it's true that growth can help you there, of GDP, because growth helps you repay the debt. So you should not totally disregard growth. We want growth to be green, of course, but don't disregard growth completely, because when the rate of growth is bigger than the safe interest rate, that allows you to repay your debt. So you have to be careful on that. So you have, of course, to make it green, but you have to invest in growth because that will help you with the debt problem. I think we have to rethink the way to implement Maastricht Treaty in Europe to distinguish between spending towards green growth and spending which are not towards growth and green growth, and to separate them. We used to say, well, whatever you do, your deficit should not go beyond 3% of GDP for member states. I think this approach is obsolete. you should look at the composition of public spending and the governance of public spending, and put some criteria, which could be greenness, absolutely, innovativeness, quality of education, PISA tests, all these things. And that will go towards more inclusive and greener. So I think we should really think differently about the way to deal with debt, being aware that, having good, if you can manage to grow, to have a rate of growth greater than the interest rate, and you want it to be green, you will have this additional advantage that you can repay your debt. That's the approach that Mario Draghi is taking in Italy. Mario Draghi says, I received European funds for COVID. I use them as collateral to borrow more. And I invest in environment, in education, in research and all that. And I think that's a good approach. And I think we should move towards this approach, to not just say, the way we used to do Maastricht. We should, it's not that we should throw Maastricht in the garbage can. We should still keep it, but we should implement it in a smarter way than we used to. Because we need to reconcile it with achieving greener growth. You see, for example, I'll tell you a story. I was in Germany. I went from Zurich to Munich. And when you go from Zurich to Munich by train, so Zurich to Lindau, it's electric traction. And from Lindau to Munich, you have diesel. Why do you, and you cough, I cough. Why do you cough? Because, they are so stingy. They don't want to electrify the train line between Lindau and Munich, because they are obsessed by the Maastricht Treaty, and they are stingy. They don't want to spend anything. That cannot go on like this. This is bad policy. If a stupid implementation of Maastricht leads you to maintain Lindau, Munich with diesel traction, it's a very stupid policy. You should not do that. You see, so you have to rethink the way of implementing the Maastricht Treaty. But it doesn't mean that you don't care about public debt, but you should care about the environmental debt. There is the public debt and the environmental debt, and you should have both in mind when you make decisions.
Exactly. So we have some questions about more of the detail of how do you actually combine all these instruments that you mention as levers. In particular, the appropriate role for public investments and policy measures to attract investments. So should the state act as a pseudo venture capitalist, as China often has done with quite spectacular results, or do you leave it more up to the market in the sense that you create the carbon price incentive, but leave leave it more technologically neutral and so on? Can you go into a bit more detail?
Yeah. So you have to do a bit of everything. The carbon price is certainly an instrument, but you have to do it very smartly, because you see in France, for example, when we increased the carbon price 3 years ago, we got France in fire. You see what I mean? So because behind the simplicity of the tax, you have a high heterogeneity of situations. And some people, it was no problem for them to pay the tax. But for some people who are suburban and living on very low income, or for them to have an increase in gasoline price was dramatic, because they didn't have an alternative. If you have the alternative, it's good. So if you have the carbon price and say, but look, you can decide to take public transportation. But when there is no public transportation, as is the case I know in Germany, you are very good with suburban transport. In France, it's terrible, suburban transport. We have very good TGV, the high-speed train between Paris and Lyon. But if you want to go from Paris to the suburb of Paris, it's terrible. You see what I mean? Terrible. So you need to take your car. And so you have to deal with the carbon tax in a very smart way. And you need to complement that by smart industrial policy. So I was mentioning the BARDA. BARDA, or the DARPA. It's a very good mixture of top-down and bottom-up. The money comes from the state. For the vaccines, for example, they have team leaders, and the team leaders elicit projects from the bottom-up. BARDA elicited, projects from many competing research centers, research labs. You have Moderna, Pfizer, and many more that you don't know, and public-private partnership and all that. So I believe in a smart industrial policy, combining top-down and bottom-up, so that you preserve competition and you don't go against competition and entry and new actors, but you stimulate it with state action, because those are missions. In the same way that you know, you had the mission of having the vaccine. You have the mission of making sure that big metropoles within a few years, no more fuel engine cars, no more fuel engine transportation, no more trucks with fuel within a few years. For that, you need DARPA or BARDA. You need this kind of organization. So you stimulate private activity, but you need to have a very strong state involvement. And I would see it at European level, not just France, isolated from Germany. I think France, Germany, and other countries should join forces in creating a European DARPA for energy to push projects and to push research and innovation on energy.
Let me add one thing on top of what Philippe said, which I agree with, that it's got to be a combo. I think there's a great role to think of say an institution like we're thinking of, where Western nations as well, where one of the commitments of having the state involved, or one of the benefits of having the state involved, is to make a commitment to say, as these technologies are developed, certain base ones will be made public and free across the world, right? We want to give the opportunity for places like sub-Saharan Africa to do that leapfrogging of certain resource-intense technologies and let them leap to the frontier. So having that state involvement gives some ownership to the public, which can then be used. So let's hand this out for free. Here's the technology to get the baseline going of installing a solar electric system. So here, now you guys aren't worrying about licensing fees and things, and we can try and assist the rest of the world at the same time. So the beauty of that research is that once it's developed, it's available, and so we want to make it as widely available as possible. And then the public partnership means that we have some ability to do that, right? It's not hiding behind patents and IP.
Okay, I'm just looking through the questions in the chat. I think we still have some skeptics in the audience that just in the most basic sense still are not yet fully convinced that you can continue having growth, even if you define growth as growth in well-being and utils, and not as output growth in a finite world. That any sort of increase in living standards, whether it's in services, whether it's creating more green innovation and so on, does require some resources, does require some energy. And maybe you can get to zero carbon, but you cannot get to zero waste streams to the ocean, biodiversity and ecosystem destruction, and so on. So I feel like there is still a cloud of doubt over the inherent contradiction between the limitless view of growth and the limit of resources.
My answer to that is, when you are in a world without innovation, you are in a Malthusian world. But I think innovation allows you to escape Malthus. I think that's the big deal. Whenever you are in a world with no innovation, it's true, the world is finite. But when you have a world with innovation, the world becomes infinite. Because, even planets, we will explore the space, other planets, there is no limit. How could you imagine, would you have imagined a year ago that we would all be vaccinated, all in developed countries, unfortunately not in developing countries, within a year? Could you imagine that? You see, I don't say, but that doesn't mean that it comes, that you should be saying, Panglossian again. It's fine. It's again the Gramscian optimism, not the Panglossian optimism. But the world is not finite, because you can always explore new territories. And so it's not true. Innovation means that the world is not finite. It doesn't mean that you should not change your habits. I think it's very important that, we try to move into more circular economy, into taking good habits of not, wasting energy, of, when we deal with, garbage, we recycle garbage. I think we need to isolate buildings. We need to have in our way to live. Maybe we used to waste a lot. We should take the habit of wasting much less. And I think that's good habit. But I think still that innovation makes the world not finite. The world is no longer finite. We will be able to go to the moon, exploit, and other planets, Mars and other planets, to exploit resources there, of course. Why not? How can you say you won't? You say, So the problem is to do it fast enough that we won't face a catastrophe before. That's the difficulty. The problem is that in principle, we could get there, but we have to move very fast now because we may face a danger of extinction and big danger if we don't move fast enough. That's the danger. It's more that for me, the problem is not so much the finiteness, is that even before we, we get to the boundaries of what we have, we disappear as a human species before because we provoke a disaster before. That's much more my worry than the finiteness.
So we have a provocative follow-up. That is that the belief in innovation without any broad evidence for real green growth, in the sense that, so far we have sort of somewhat marginal improvements, is a bit unscientific. And so you're making a leap of faith, in other words, Philippe. And so some people are asking, what's plan B, basically? This is a huge risk we're taking on betting just on innovation when we don't have such a good empirical basis to actually show that it can do the job.
But we know it can, because if I didn't have the nuclear plants, France could not achieve a reduction in CO2 together with positive growth. Alors, nuclear is not the answer, but nuclear was the product of an innovation and new technologies. Alors, we will do better than the nuclear. We hope to get the nuclear fusion, which would be fantastic, or hydrogen, and we keep searching. But innovation already, if you do the right policy, you can achieve reduction in CO2 emission together with growth, already with the technologies we have, if you implement them. So, of course, the problem is that the cost is too high so far. So you have to innovate also towards reducing. It's not only to discover new source of energy. The innovation is to reduce the cost of using sources that we know how to manage. And innovation will be a lot there. I mean, China, we should find it profitable to stop all the coal plants and replace them all by other things, but they find that too costly so far. So we have to also improve the cost of already technologies that we have, but we are still too expensive to, and which if we implement them large scale, would already help us a lot achieve the goal that we look for.
Yeah,
You see what I mean?
I mean, I think there's evidence that we have, right? We've run into limits and we have innovated for decades away from certain resources. Now, not all, right? And then it's clearly I think what the question's getting at, right? Are we just kind of shuffling from one resource to the other? But we know in some sense that it's possible to stop the curve going up and to even see it decline. You know, total CO2 emissions in most Western countries are in absolute terms lower than they were 20 or 30 years ago.
Well, they're only very slightly lower when you take into account consumption emissions, meaning that we are importing embedded emissions, and they're declining extremely slowly, mostly in Europe. So the evidence is not great.
It's possible to change the curve, and there are other indicators. So, you know, the total amount of agricultural land in the US is lower today than it was 20 and 30 years ago. So, and that's not the answer to say, oh, clearly we can get to zero, right? Kind of environmental footprint. But it's possible to move in those proper directions. Now, I mean, ultimately, if there are people on Earth, we're going to have an environmental impact. Zero is in some sense an implausible number unless we get rid of people, right? But can we get to the point where we are not, I don't know what that right metric is. I mean, zero is,
No, it's not crossing critical boundaries, right?
Right, where we're not actively, in some sense, destroying the environment. And I always struggle with what that, and I don't know that there is a right answer to it, or like what kind of the right metric is. But there is the case that we have innovated away from certain impacts, right? We see this in terms of certain amounts of pollutants and things that are down in mass numbers, you know. So it's been possible to do it in small, narrow ways. So we know it's possible. Now, can we take it, as like Philippe said, can we get a more maybe broader civil society, state, market combination that takes us more broadly and we've used, both of us, I think, have used energy and CO2 emissions as kind of the main thrust. And I think I agree with Philippe that that's kind of the most immediate one. But to maybe the questioner's point, can we take that to all these aspects of our impacts on landscapes and wildlife and the resources that are available, and take the lessons we had from the past about innovating away from impacts and push them in that direction? I think we can. Is it scientific that we can, do we have 1 million Earths that we've looked at over time and can do, like, run an experiment and say, well, no. But in that sense, it's, I don't think that's the standard to know how we would judge whether market innovation and creative destruction can achieve this.
Mm-hmm. We have a question about the African development context. Professor Aghion said that helping African countries skip in this industrialization and jump from agriculture-dominated to service-dominated economy, so have a very accelerated sort of structural change, would help and keep the carbon footprint as low as it is today. So how would you reconcile that with the fact that this transition have been almost achieved, but led to very low growth, and a large growth in the informal sector, and hence an inability to reduce poverty? So what's required, in other words, to make a big dent on poverty while keeping the...
So I think it would be important to make sure that, standards of living improve in those countries quickly. You see, through trade, also doing trade, not giving them a chance to develop and develop through services, a combination of exportable services. You see what I mean? We would produce industrial goods in countries where pollution is very low, where we have cheap access to nuclear and these kind of things and other sources of energy. And we would exchange for services in those countries that they could export, or combine goods and services the way they could export. And that would allow them to get richer. If they get richer, we know that there is a good force that plays for us, is that we know that when people get richer, wealthier individuals, they tend to consume more services. So there is a demand for services. And the demand for services fuels an innovation which is targeted towards services. You see, that's the idea. The idea is to say, well, you want standards of living to improve fast enough in those countries that there will be a growing demand for services, because you have what we call non-homothetic preferences. People, we know, as they get richer, they consume a lower fraction of manufactured goods and a higher fraction of services. So as standards of living will improve, they will become more demanders of services. That will fuel, they will create market size for innovations directed at services. And that will be the source of the growth. You see what I mean? That's the way you would do it, by creating the conditions of a market size driven endogenous growth directed to services. And that's the bet to do. And the whole thing is how to get there. But that I think is because you have this very nice thing that plays for us is the combination of these non-homothetic preferences that people, when they get richer, they consume a higher fraction of service, together with the fact that demand fuels innovation, because you innovate to serve a demand. And these two things together, we should make the maximum of it.
I think there's a point too, and we have to understand that countries, say in sub-Saharan Africa, are developing. There's a historical context to this. There's Europe developed and the United States developed at a time when essentially producing the things of material kind of living standards was an expensive project. It was resource intensive, it was labor intensive. It took a lot. So we ended up with these economies that had massive manufacturing sectors because we were really bad at it, right? Like we were not very efficient at it. And so in some sense you can take advantage, those countries don't have to go through a period when a third of their workforce is in manufacturing, because they can leverage the fact that we've now understood how to become very good at producing those elements of material living standards. And that may occur because they're able to import it, right? To the point that Philippe made about trade. And that may be an avenue to making it resource friendly. And it may be technology transfer, in the sense that we do think we're like, look, okay, you're going to have a homegrown industry that produces whatever we're thinking of, some consumer products, TVs. Well, there's a technology out there to do that hyper efficiently with sourced from materials. So they're able to skip manufacturing in some sense, partly because they're coming later. And there's kind of this old, kind of the advantage of backwardness that Gershon Kron had talked about a century ago. That there is an element to that. There's a real element that you kind of get to skip. And we've seen that with kind of the mobile phone versus landline thing, that they're able to take advantage and jump to a frontier. And it may look like a differential structural change process that doesn't look typical historically, but that doesn't mean that it's worse off. So I think there's a path to high development and high living standards for these countries, even despite not having mass manufacturing. It doesn't mean they don't have mass abilities to have basic material goods and living standards. Yeah.
Great. So I'm gonna take moderator's privilege to ask one last question that's not in the chat, and that is on the role of inequality. Do you see inequality as creating additional barriers to rapid green innovation?
Yeah, so it's interesting because yeah, I mean, it depends which kind of inequality. You see, I mean, you have to be very careful. I mean, for example, what's important is the lack of social mobility, I think. You see what I mean? I think it's important, as I said before, education should be accessible to everyone. Everybody should, and everybody should have the opportunity to do things, to realize their ambition, and to have ambition, and to have aspiration. So in the lack of inequality in access to opportunities, in access to aspirations, in access to knowledge, that stifles innovation. So that's the inequality. The exposed inequality in wealth, even in Sweden, you have rich and poor people. You don't have very poor people. I think the big problem is poverty, the poverty traps, the lack of mobility. That's for me the problem. That you have rich people is not a big deal as long as the rich do not use their wealth to prevent future innovations. So that's the problem. You want to make sure that the rich don't buy out the political system. In the US, they lobby, the rich lobby. And when they lobby, they put entry barriers. And they try to bias the political system to defend their vested interests. That's not good because they stifle innovation, entry, and all that. So, I think the way I see is that you want social mobility, you want education and health for everybody so that people can realize their innovative potential. You minimize the number of lost Einsteins. Having people who earn a lot, it's okay as long as there is a no-fly zone on them, that they can use their wealth. They cannot use their wealth to prevent competition and entry, to bias the political system. You see, that's important. But that you do through taxation, progressive taxation, through competition policy, and through very strict rules to finance political campaigns. In the US, companies have no limit in the ability to finance campaigns. That's very bad. In Europe, in particular in Northern Europe, you have very strict rules for financing campaigns, you see, because you don't want money to buy out politicians. So, so that's where you have to act, I think. Those are the levers you want to act. Yeah.
I think that, right, to add to Philippe's point, I think it's that both ends of that scale that matter, because if you've got people at the top end lobbying against, say, changes because it will hurt their own industry. But I think at the bottom, the danger is that, I mean, there is an element to which kind of environmental quality is something of a privileged good, right? Kind of on the, people who are very poor maybe are going to be far more worried about, like, I'm just worried about, can I get to work and can I feed my kids today? And they're not terribly worried necessarily about, say, the carbon footprint that they're occurring. And I think, Philippe's example of the suburbs, a carbon tax on people who live and only have access to a car is just a pain for them. They're not able to switch. So in a place like the US, where we have this like mass inequality, we've got the lobbying at the top, but we also have resistance at the bottom, because the costs of a transition or innovation or policies that push say a carbon tax are felt mainly as pain, and there's not a whole lot of chance to substitute away and take advantage of an alternative that's out there. So I think inequality is kind of, in some sense, one of the big barriers to achieving this push, because in some sense, it'll be more effective if the civil society is asking for it. If the market is, the customers are demanding these green technologies, then the market will start producing them. But at some level, if we need people to have the living standard to demand that, right? To make that a priority. So I think we do have an obligation in some sense to support, I think, especially at the bottom end, and the beautiful feedback of this is, as Philippe said, is then you are also creating a whole new world of potential innovators and entrepreneurs who can play in the system. So it has this positive feedback loop that would be wonderful, I think, and we're kind of throwing away a lot of chances by not addressing it. So I think it's one of the key elements to making this all work. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, both, and thank you for the very engaged, challenging audience. You didn't have as much chance to read the chat, but the Q&A, but it was very active. I think we have quite a bit of consensus on the fact that GDP is not really the focus, and that we can keep very high levels of innovation and direction and innovation with the right set of policies in a way that increases well-being in the environment, but that this is a big fight. So we have Gramscian optimism. I really like this framing. And I think we'll end on that note. So thank you very much for...
Excellent, thank you. Thank you very much.
To discuss with you and Marion. Very
thank you, Philippe.
Great pleasure. Well, bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.